Little girl courageously shows up for a job interview to raise hospital bills for her sick mom. Unknown to the wealthy CEO, her mom is his ex-wife. "You left us," the 9-year-old whispered, her small hands clenching into fists as tears streamed down her cheeks. "Mom cried sometimes when she thought I was sleeping. She said my father was a good man who just got scared, but I think you're just selfish." The billionaire CEO felt his world crumble as he stared at the brilliant little girl sitting across from his mahogany desk, the daughter he never knew existed, the child of the woman whose heart he'd shattered 10 years ago. "You're right," Garrett admitted, his voice breaking. "I was selfish. I was scared and stupid, and I threw away the most precious things in my life. But Grace, please, let me help your mother now. Let me try to make up for." "No." Grace shot to her feet. "We don't need you. Mom and I have been just fine without you, and we'll figure this out without your money." But what this 9-year-old coding prodigy didn't know was that her desperate attempt to save her dying mother's life had just brought her face to face with the father who abandoned them and changed all their lives forever. Welcome back to Lux Love Chronicles with Mr. Wentworth, where every story has the power to transform hearts and heal broken souls. If you're new here, I'm absolutely thrilled you've joined our family of dreamers and believers. To my beloved subscribers, thank you for being the heartbeat of this channel. Your likes, comments, and shares don't just boost algorithms, they spread hope to millions of people who need to hear these stories of redemption and second chances. Before we dive into today's incredible journey, let me offer a prayer for each one of you watching. May your heart be filled with peace that surpasses all understanding. May every door you need open be opened, and every door you need closed be closed. May abundance flow into your life, not just financially, but in love, health, joy, and purpose. May you find the courage to forgive those who've hurt you and the strength to ask forgiveness from those you've wronged. And may you always remember that it's never too late for a miracle in your life. Amen. Now, let's dive into a story that will remind you why children are often the angels God sends to heal broken families. The mahogany door to the executive suite closed with a whisper behind 9-year-old Grace Mitchell as she stepped into the most intimidating office she'd ever seen. Manhattan sprawled endlessly beyond massive windows, but her focus remained fixed on the man behind the imposing desk, Garrett Stone, CEO of Stone Enterprises and one of the most powerful men in America. Grace clutched her small backpack tighter, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times in her bedroom mirror, but standing here now, she felt impossibly small. The chair across from his desk seemed enormous, her feet barely touching the ground when she sat down. "Miss Mitchell," Garrett's voice was smooth as aged whiskey, with an underlying steel that commanded boardrooms and crushed competitors. At 38, he was devastatingly handsome in the way that only came with absolute confidence and unlimited resources. Dark hair, piercing blue eyes, and a jawline that spoke of generations of privilege. He paused, studying the young girl before him with obvious confusion. "I have to admit, when my assistant said Grace Mitchell was here for an interview, I wasn't expecting a kid." Grace finished, her chin lifting with fierce determination despite the tremor in her voice. "I know I'm young, Mr. Stone, but I can do things other people can't." Something flickered across his features at her last name, Mitchell. The name stirred memories he'd buried deep, but the coincidence seemed impossible. Still, there was something achingly familiar about those defiant green eyes, the stubborn set of her small shoulders. "Grace Mitchell," he repeated slowly, his voice catching slightly on the surname. "And what exactly is it you think you can do for Stone Enterprises?" Grace reached into her backpack and pulled out a tablet, her small fingers flying across the screen with practiced ease. "I built this app in 3 weeks. It's a medical monitoring system that tracks patient vitals and sends real-time alerts to doctors." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke about her passion. "The coding is clean, the interface is intuitive, and it could save thousands of lives." Garrett leaned forward, genuinely intrigued despite his shock at her age. The app was sophisticated, more advanced than programs created by his senior developers. This wasn't some child's toy. This was professional-grade software that could revolutionize healthcare monitoring. "This is impressive," he admitted, scrolling through the app's features. "But Grace, you're 9 years old. Why aren't you in school? Why are you here trying to get a job? The question hit too close to home. Grace's rehearsed confidence cracked, and for a moment, she looked exactly like what she was, a frightened little girl carrying the weight of the world on her tiny shoulders. My mom, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. She's sick, really sick. The doctors say there's a new treatment that could help her, but insurance won't cover it because it's experimental. It costs $50,000. Garrett's chest tightened. The desperation in her voice, the way she held herself together despite being so young, it reminded him of someone he'd lost long ago. Someone he'd walked away from when they needed him most. What's your mother's name, Grace? Riley Mitchell. Well, she used to be Riley Parker before she got married. Grace's voice softened when she spoke of her mother, love and worry intertwining in her words. She's the best person in the world. She works 3 jobs just to keep us afloat, and she still finds time to help me with my coding projects. The world stopped. Riley Parker, the brilliant medical student he'd fallen impossibly in love with 12 years ago. The woman whose heart he'd shattered when his ambition and fear had driven him to abandon her, and the pregnancy she'd tearfully confessed to him the night before he'd walked away forever. Garrett's hands trembled as the truth crashed over him like a tidal wave. This wasn't just any desperate child sitting in his office. This was his daughter, his flesh and blood, brilliant and beautiful and breaking her heart, trying to save the woman he'd been too much of a coward to fight for. Grace. His voice was barely a whisper, thick with emotion he couldn't contain. How old did you say you were? 9. I'll be 10 in March. She tilted her head, confused by the strange intensity in his gaze, the way color had drained from his face. Mr. Stone, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. March. 10 months after he'd left Riley sobbing in their tiny apartment, convinced he was protecting them both from a future he wasn't ready for. He'd been building Stone Enterprises, terrified that love would make him weak, that a family would distract him from his goals. He'd chosen ambition over love and lost everything that mattered. Your father, Garrett managed, his throat raw with emotion. Is he part of your life? Grace's expression hardened, a flash of pain crossing her young features, pain that looked far too old for her 9-year-old face. I don't have a father. Mom says he left before I was born because he wasn't ready to be a dad. She says maybe someday I'll understand, but honestly, I think he's just a coward who didn't want us. Each word was a dagger to his heart. His daughter, their daughter, had grown up believing he'd abandoned them by choice, never knowing how desperately he'd regretted his decision, how many nights he'd lain awake wondering about the child he'd left behind. The irony was devastating. Here she was, this brilliant little girl, seeking help from the very man who'd walked away from her before she was born. And she had no idea she was looking into the eyes of the father she'd grown up resenting. Grace, he said gently, fighting to keep his voice steady, I want to help your mother. Whatever treatment she needs, whatever it costs. No, Grace's voice was firm despite her young age, her jaw set with a stubbornness he recognized as his own. Mom would never take charity, especially from a stranger. She's too proud. I need to earn this money myself. Garrett stared at this fierce little girl who had his stubborn pride and Riley's compassionate heart. The courage it must have taken for a 9-year-old to walk into his office, to present her app with such confidence, to carry the weight of her mother's life on her shoulders. What if I told you I'm not a stranger? He asked carefully, his heart pounding. What if I told you that I knew your mother before you were born? Grace's eyes narrowed with suspicion, intelligence flashing in those green eyes so much like his own. You knew my mom? How? The words stuck in his throat. How could he explain to a 9-year-old that he was the father who'd abandoned her? That he'd spent 10 years drowning in regret, successful beyond his wildest dreams, but empty without the family he'd thrown away? We were close. Very close. I made mistakes, Grace. Terrible mistakes that I've regretted every day since. Understanding dawned in Grace's intelligent eyes, followed quickly by anger. Her small face transformed, hurt and betrayal replacing the hope that had been there moments before. You're him, aren't you? She whispered, her voice shaking. You're my father. The accusation hung between them like a live wire. Garrett nodded slowly, his heart breaking at the betrayal and fury in his daughter's face. You left us, Grace whispered, her small hands clenching into fists as tears began streaming down her cheeks. Mom cried sometimes when she thought I was sleeping. She said my father was a good man who just got scared, but I think you're just selfish. You're right, Garrett admitted, his voice breaking as 10 years of buried guilt came flooding out. I was selfish. I was scared and stupid, and I threw away the most precious things in my life. But Grace, please, let me help your mother now. Let me try to make up for. No. Grace shot to her feet, tears streaming down her cheeks, her small body shaking with rage and hurt. We don't need you. Mom and I have been just fine without you, and we'll figure this out without your money. She grabbed her backpack and ran for the door, but Garrett's voice stopped her. Grace, wait. Your mother, what kind of sick is she? Grace's shoulders shook with suppressed sobs. She turned back to him, her young face aged by worry and grief that no child should have to bear. Cancer. Stage 4. The doctors say, her voice broke. They say without the new treatment, she might only have months left. The words hit Garrett like a physical blow. Riley, beautiful, vibrant Riley, was dying, and he'd wasted 10 years staying away because he'd been too ashamed to face what he'd done. Please, he begged, rising from his chair and taking a step toward her. Let me at least try to help. Not because of me, but because she deserves every chance to fight this. Because you deserve to have your mother healthy and whole. Grace turned back to him, her young face a battlefield of emotions, anger, desperation, hope, and a wisdom far beyond her years. She'd rather die than take money from you, Grace said, her voice steady despite her tears. She still loves you, you know, even after everything you did to us. Mom still keeps a picture of you in her jewelry box. The revelation nearly brought Garrett to his knees. After all these years, after all the pain he'd caused, Riley still kept his picture. Still loved him despite everything. Then don't tell her it's from me, he said desperately. Let me set up a medical fund, make it look like a charity case or a research grant. Grace, I'm a billionaire. $50,000 is nothing to me, but everything to you. Grace stared at him for a long moment, weighing her pride against her mother's life. The internal struggle played out across her young features, the desire to reject anything from the man who'd abandoned them warring with her desperate love for her dying mother. Finally, she nodded. Okay, but not for you, for her. And when she gets better, you have to promise to stay away from us. I promise, Garrett lied, knowing even as the words left his mouth that he'd move heaven and earth to find a way back into their lives. If you've ever made a mistake that haunted you for years, drop a comment below. Sometimes our biggest regrets lead to our greatest redemptions. Grace turned to leave, then stopped at the door without looking back. You know what the worst part is, she said quietly. I used to dream about meeting you. I used to imagine you were some kind of hero who got lost and couldn't find his way back to us. But you're just a man who chose money over love. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Garrett alone in his billion-dollar office, surrounded by all the success he'd thought mattered, realizing that a 9-year-old girl had just delivered the most devastating and accurate assessment of his entire life. 3 days later, Garrett stood outside Mercy General Hospital, his hands shaking as he prepared to see Riley for the first time in 10 years. He'd worked around the clock to arrange the treatment through a medical research foundation he'd quietly established, making sure Riley believed she'd been randomly selected for the experimental program. The antiseptic smell of the hospital hit him as he walked through the corridors, his expensive Italian shoes silent on the polished floors. Room 314. The number had been burned into his memory since his assistant had given him Riley's room information. He paused outside the door, his hand frozen on the handle. What would he say to her? How could he possibly explain 10 years of absence, 10 years of wondering, 10 years of regret? Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door. The woman who looked up when he entered took his breath away. Riley was thinner than he remembered, her golden hair shorter and lacking its former luster, but her green eyes still held the warmth and intelligence that had captured his heart all those years ago. When she saw him, the color drained from her face. Garrett. Her voice was barely a whisper, as if she couldn't quite believe he was real. Hello, Riley. He moved closer, drinking in the sight of her after so many years of regret. I heard you were sick. I needed to see you. How did you? Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed by a flash of maternal protectiveness. Grace. She went to you, didn't she? My brilliant, stubborn little girl. She loves you enough to swallow her pride and ask for help, Garrett said, his voice thick with emotion. That's more than I ever did. He sat down in the chair beside her bed, careful not to touch her despite every instinct screaming at him to hold her close, to make up for all the lost time with a single embrace. Riley, I'm so sorry. For leaving, for being a coward, for wasting 10 years. Stop. Riley's voice was firm despite her weakness. You made your choice, Garrett. You chose your company over us. I've made my peace with that. Have you? He searched her face, seeing the walls she'd built around her heart, the strength she'd developed in his absence. Because Grace says you still have my picture. Riley's cheeks flushed, and for a moment, she looked like the young woman he'd fallen in love with all those years ago. That's for Grace. She deserves to know what her father looks like, even if he's not in her life. I want to be in her life, Riley. I want to be in your life. I know I don't deserve another chance, but you're right. You don't. Her words were quiet but firm, each one landing like a physical blow. Do you have any idea what it was like? Being pregnant and alone, working my way through medical school while raising a baby? Grace didn't speak until she was almost 2 because I was so exhausted I barely talked to her. I failed her in so many ways because you weren't there to help. Each word was a knife to his heart, but Garrett forced himself to listen. He deserved every ounce of her anger, every painful truth about what his choices had cost them. But she's incredible, Riley continued, her voice softening with unmistakable pride. Brilliant and kind and so much stronger than either of us ever were. She's the best thing I've ever done, Garrett. The only good thing to come from our relationship. No, Garrett said quietly, his voice filled with raw honesty. The good thing was loving you. Losing both of you, is the greatest regret of my life. Riley's breath caught, and for a moment, her carefully constructed walls wavered. Her green eyes, once so full of love for him, now held a mixture of pain and something else, something that looked dangerously like hope. Garrett, I know you can't forgive me. I know I don't deserve it. But please, let me try to be the father Grace deserves. Let me help her, guide her, be there for her in all the ways I should have been from the beginning. Tears spilled down Riley's cheeks, and she turned her face away, struggling to maintain the composure that had kept her strong for 10 lonely years. She's angry with you, Riley whispered. She thinks you abandoned us because you didn't want to be a father. Then I'll spend the rest of my life proving her wrong. I'll show her every day that leaving was the biggest mistake I ever made. Riley looked back at him, studying his face with the intensity of a woman who'd been hurt too deeply to trust easily. And what about me, Garrett? What about the woman you left crying in a tiny apartment, terrified and alone? The question hung between them, heavy with years of unspoken pain. Garrett reached out slowly, his fingers barely brushing hers before she pulled away. I would spend every day for the rest of my life proving to you that you're worth fighting for, that you always were. I was just too much of a coward to see it. Before Riley could respond, the door burst open and Grace rushed in, her school backpack sliding off her shoulder as she hurried to her mother's bedside. Mom, how was your treatment today? Did the new medicine make you feel sick again? Grace's words tumbled out in a rush of concern before she noticed Garrett sitting there. Her face immediately hardened. What is he doing here? Grace, Riley said gently, we were just talking. About what? About how he's going to disappear again when things get complicated? Grace's young voice was sharp with protective anger. Mom, you don't need him. We've been fine on our own. Garrett felt his heart break all over again, watching his daughter's fierce protection of her mother. This little girl had been Riley's guardian, her strength, her reason to keep fighting, all the things he should have been. You're right, Grace, Garrett said quietly. You and your mother have been more than fine. You've been extraordinary, but I want to be here now, if you'll let me. Why? Grace demanded, crossing her arms. So you can feel better about yourself? So you can tell people you're a good dad? The accusation stung because there was truth in it. Part of him did want absolution, did want to ease the guilt that had eaten at him for a decade. No, he said honestly. I want to be here because I love you both. Because I've missed 10 years of your life, Grace, and I don't want to miss another day. Because your mother is the strongest, most incredible woman I've ever known, and I was a fool to walk away from her." Grace studied him with those intelligent green eyes, weighing his words against her years of resentment. "Prove it," she said finally. "What? Prove you're not going to leave again. Prove you actually care about us, and not just your guilty conscience." Garrett looked between his daughter and the woman he'd never stopped loving, both of them watching him with cautious hope and deep skepticism. "How?" he asked simply. "Be here," Grace said. "Every day? Not just when it's convenient or when you feel guilty. Be here when Mom has bad days from the treatment. Be here when she can't keep food down. Be here when she's scared in the middle of the night." The challenge was clear, and Garrett nodded without hesitation. "I'll be here." Over the following weeks, Garrett kept his word. He restructured his entire life around hospital visiting hours, moving meetings, delegating responsibilities he'd never trusted to anyone else. His assistant Rachel watched in amazement as the man who'd never taken a sick day suddenly cleared his calendar every afternoon. "Mr. Stone, the board meeting with the Tokyo investors, reschedule it," Garrett said without looking up from the files on his desk. "I have somewhere more important to be." He was there when Riley's treatment made her violently ill, holding a basin and stroking her hair as she retched. He was there when Grace fell asleep in the uncomfortable hospital chair, carefully lifting her to the small couch in the corner. He was there during the long, scary nights when Riley's fever spiked and Grace sat rigid with terror, whispering prayers she was too young to need. "You don't have to stay," Riley told him one particularly difficult night when the experimental drugs had left her weak and nauseous. "Grace and I can handle this." "I know you can," Garrett replied, adjusting her blankets with gentle hands. "You've been handling everything alone for 10 years. But you don't have to anymore." He started small, children's books that mysteriously appeared at the nurse's station for Grace, flowers that showed up in Riley's room with unsigned cards. He used his connections discreetly, ensuring Riley had the best doctors, the most comfortable private room, experimental medications that weren't available to the general public. Dr. Martinez, Riley's oncologist, pulled Garrett aside one afternoon. "I don't know who your anonymous benefactor is, Mr. Stone, but the entire cancer wing has been upgraded. New equipment, additional staff, expanded research funding. Whoever they are, they're saving lives." Garrett just nodded, saying nothing. Grace was watching him from across the hallway, and he saw the exact moment she put the pieces together. Grace was suspicious at first, but gradually began to soften. She'd catch him reading to other children in the pediatric ward during visiting hours, his deep voice gentle as he brought fairy tales to life for scared little ones. She noticed how the hospital staff spoke of the anonymous benefactor who'd quietly upgraded the entire cancer wing. Despite her anger, she couldn't help but be impressed by the man who was slowly revealing himself to be worthy of her brilliant mother. "Mr. Stone." Grace approached him one day as he sat reading to a little boy whose parents couldn't visit. "Why do you read to the other kids?" Garrett looked up from the picture book, considering his answer carefully. "Because every child deserves to feel like they matter. Because sometimes, when someone's scared and alone, a story can make them feel less afraid. Like how I was scared and alone before?" Grace asked quietly. "You were never alone, Grace. You had your mother, and she's worth 10 of me. But yes, like that." Grace nodded slowly, then surprised him by climbing into the chair beside him. "Can you read to me too?" Share this video if you believe people can truly change when love is on the line. The real breakthrough came 3 weeks into Riley's treatment. Grace had been spending every free moment at the hospital, sleeping in the uncomfortable chair beside her mother's bed. Garrett found them like that one evening, Riley sleeping peacefully for the first time in days, Grace curled up in the chair, her small face peaceful but her neck bent at an awkward angle. He couldn't resist gently lifting his daughter, surprised by how light she was, how fragile she felt in his arms. As he carried her to the small couch where she could sleep more comfortably, Grace stirred. "Daddy?" she whispered, still half asleep, and Garrett's heart nearly shattered from the sweetness of it. "Sleep, sweetheart," he murmured, covering her with his jacket and stroking her hair with trembling fingers. "I'll watch over you both." When Grace woke hours later, she found Garrett sitting vigilantly beside Riley's bed, holding her mother's hand as she slept. Something in his posture, the tenderness, The protective way he watched over them melted the last of Grace's resistance. "You really love her, don't you?" Grace whispered. Garrett looked at his daughter with eyes full of regret and hope. "More than my own life. I've loved her every day for 10 years, Grace. I just forgot how to fight for the things that matter. And me? Do you love me too?" The vulnerability in her young voice broke his heart completely. This brilliant, brave little girl shouldn't have to question whether she was worthy of love. "Oh, sweetheart," he said, opening his arms to her. "You are the most amazing thing I never knew I needed. I love you so much it hurts to breathe. I'm sorry it took me so long to find the courage to come home to you." Grace studied him for a long moment, then slowly climbed into his lap, her small body fitting perfectly against his chest. "I missed having a daddy," she admitted against his shirt. "Even though I didn't know you, I missed you." Garrett held his daughter close, tears streaming down his face as 10 years of regret began to transform into hope. "I missed you too, Grace. Every single day." Riley stirred in her bed, her eyes opening to find Garrett and Grace together for the first time. The sight of them, her daughter finally accepting the father who'd been absent for so long, brought tears to her eyes. "How long have you been awake?" Garrett asked softly. "Long enough," Riley whispered. "Long enough to see that maybe we really can be a family." The next few weeks brought steady improvement. Riley's body responded better to the treatment than anyone had dared hope. Her color returned, her appetite improved, and the terrible fatigue that had plagued her began to lift. More importantly, the three of them began to heal as a family. Garrett brought homework help for Grace, teaching her advanced coding techniques that had her teachers amazed. He brought real food to the hospital when Riley grew tired of the cafeteria meals. He brought hope to both of them when the darkest moments threatened to overwhelm their courage. "Tell me about your company," Grace said one afternoon as they sat in the hospital garden. "What's it like being in charge of everything?" "Lonely," Garrett answered honestly. "Success doesn't mean much when you have no one to share it with. But you must be really smart to build such a big company." "Smart enough to build $1 billion empire," Garrett said, looking at Riley, "but too stupid to realize I already had everything I needed." "You're different than I thought you'd be," Grace admitted. "I always imagined you'd be mean or selfish or just bad. But you're not bad. You're just scared, like Mom said. Your mother always was wiser than me." Riley's recovery was miraculous. The experimental treatment worked better than anyone dared hope, and within 2 months, she was declared cancer-free. But the real healing happened slowly, in quiet moments between the three of them. Garrett courted Riley like a lovesick teenager, bringing her coffee each morning, reading to her during treatments, staying by her bedside through the difficult nights. He approached their damaged relationship with the patience of a man who understood he had everything to prove and all the time in the world to prove it. "Why?" Riley asked him one evening as they sat in the hospital garden, Grace playing nearby on the small playground the hospital had installed for young patients. "Why come back now? You could have stayed away, lived your life without the complications we bring." Garrett reached for her hand, his heart soaring when she didn't pull away immediately. "Because I finally understood that success without you means nothing. I built an empire thinking it would make me worthy of love, but I already had everything I needed. I was just too much of a fool to see it." "I'm not the same woman you left, Garrett," Riley said, her voice carrying the strength she'd developed in his absence. "I'm harder now, more suspicious. I've had to be strong for so long. I'm not sure I remember how to be vulnerable." "Good," he smiled, bringing her hand to his lips and pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I don't want easy. I want you, complicated, brilliant, fierce you. I want the woman who raised our daughter to be extraordinary while I was playing with spreadsheets. I want the surgeon who saves lives every day, the mother who loves so fiercely she'd do anything to protect her child." Riley's carefully constructed walls finally began to crumble. "I never stopped loving you," she whispered, the admission torn from her heart. "Even when I hated you, I loved you." "How pathetic is that?" "Not pathetic," Garrett murmured, pulling her closer on the garden bench. "Hopeful, because I never stopped loving you either." From the playground, Grace watched her parents with the wisdom of a child who'd carried adult burdens for too long. She'd orchestrated this moment without even knowing it, Her desperate trip to Garrett's office had brought them all full circle. "Are you getting back together?" Grace asked as she approached them, her question direct in the way only children can be. Garrett and Riley looked at each other, then at their daughter. "Would that be okay with you?" Riley asked gently. Grace pretended to consider this seriously, tapping her chin with one finger in an exaggerated thinking pose. "Well," she said finally, "I guess I could get used to having a dad around. But," she added, pointing a small finger at Garrett, "you have to promise never to leave us again." "I promise," Garrett said solemnly, meeting her eyes with the gravity the moment deserved. "I will never leave you again. And you have to teach me everything about running a company, because someday I want to build something even bigger than Stone Enterprises." "Deal." "And you have to take Mom on proper dates, not just hospital cafeteria coffee." Riley laughed, the sound like music after so many months of worry. "Grace." "What?" "You deserve nice dates, Mom. You haven't been on a real date in, well, ever." Garrett chuckled, pulling both his girls closer. "Your daughter drives a hard bargain. She gets that from both of us," Riley said, leaning into his embrace for the first time in 10 years. The transition wasn't without its challenges. Grace tested Garrett constantly, pushing boundaries to see if he'd really stay when things got difficult. There were tears, arguments, and moments when old hurts surfaced despite everyone's best intentions. "I hate you," Grace shouted one afternoon when Garrett had to miss her school presentation for an emergency board meeting. "You promised you'd be there." "Grace, I'm sorry. The merger. There's always going to be something more important than us, isn't there? Just like before." The accusation hit home because Garrett had been struggling to balance his company responsibilities with his newfound family obligations. Riley watched from the doorway as Grace ran to her room, slamming the door behind her. "She's right," Garrett said quietly. "I'm making the same mistakes all over again." "No," Riley said, moving to stand beside him. "You're learning. It's going to take time for all of us to figure out how to be a family." "But Garrett, you can't just abandon your company either. Find the balance." That night, Garrett made a decision that would have been unthinkable months earlier. He promoted his deputy CEO to full CEO, stepping back to chairman of the board, a role that would give him oversight without the day-to-day demands that had consumed his life for so long. "You did what?" Grace asked when he told her the next morning. "I restructured my role at the company so I can be here for the important things. Like school presentations. And soccer games if you're interested in trying soccer." Grace stared at him for a long moment, then threw her arms around his waist. "I'm sorry I said I hated you. I didn't mean it. I know, sweetheart. But even if you had meant it, I'd still love you. That's what family means." 6 months later, Garrett Stone, billionaire, technology mogul, and fool who'd learned the value of love too late, but just in time, knelt in the same hospital garden where they'd found their way back to each other. Grace stood beside him, practically vibrating with excitement as she held the ring box they'd picked out together. "Riley Parker," Garrett said, his voice shaking with emotion, "will you give me the honor of spending the rest of my life proving I'm worthy of the second chance you've given me?" Riley looked at the man who'd broken her heart and then spent months tenderly putting it back together, at the daughter who'd brought them all full circle, at the family they'd almost lost to fear and pride. "Yes," she whispered, and when Garrett slipped the ring onto her finger, Grace cheered loud enough to wake half the hospital. If you believe in the power of second chances, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because everyone deserves a love story like this. They were married 3 months later in a small ceremony at the same hospital where they'd found their way back to each other. Grace walked Riley down the aisle, her small hand steady and sure as she delivered her mother to the man who'd finally learned to fight for his family. In her vows, Riley promised to love Garrett not despite his past mistakes, but because his journey back to them had shown her the depth of his love. Garrett promised to spend every remaining day of his life proving that love was worth more than any empire he could build. As they danced at their reception, Grace tucked safely between them. Garrett marveled at the 9-year-old girl whose desperate love for her mother had brought them all home. His brilliant daughter, who'd coded her way into his office and his heart, had given them all the greatest gift of all, a second chance at the family they were always meant to be. "You know what the best part is?" Grace said, looking up at her parents as they swayed to the music. "What's that, sweetheart?" Riley asked. "Now when people ask about my dad, I can tell them he's not perfect, but he came back. And that's what matters." Garrett knelt down to Grace's level, his voice thick with emotion. "And when people ask me about my greatest achievement, I'll tell them it's not the billion-dollar company or the awards on my wall. It's earning the right to be called Daddy by the bravest little girl in the world." Grace threw her arms around his neck, and Riley joined their embrace, three hearts that had found their way back to each other despite impossible odds. "I love you both," Garrett whispered into their hair. "Thank you for never giving up on us. We're a family now," Grace declared with the certainty only children possess. "Forever and always." "Forever and always," Riley and Garrett echoed, sealing their promise with a kiss as their daughter giggled between them. Sometimes the greatest miracles come in the smallest packages. Grace's courage to walk into that boardroom, armed with nothing but love for her mother and a brilliant mind, changed 3 lives forever. Her story reminds us that it's never too late to fight for what matters, never too late to come home, and never too late for love to triumph over pride and fear. The little girl who showed up for a job interview did more than just save her mother's life. She saved her father's soul and restored a family that was always meant to be. Your turn now. Drop a comment below and tell me, what's the bravest thing you've ever done for someone you love? And don't forget to subscribe to Lux Love Chronicles for more stories that prove love always wins in the end. This is Mr. Wentworth, reminding you to never give up on love, never give up on family, and never underestimate the power of a child's pure heart to heal the world. God bless you all, and I'll see you in the next story.